I never thought a single joke would end my marriage, but the divorce papers on my table say otherwise. My name is Mirabelle, and I am 31 years old, working as a receptionist in a small office where nothing ever changes. My husband Jonathan is 35 and works as a financial analyst, spending long hours with spreadsheets and reports. We live in a neat suburban home with our 2 children, Lily, who is 7, and Aaron, who is 5. People always said we were the perfect match because I was lively and outgoing, while Jonathan was steady and quiet. I liked hearing that because it made me feel special and important, even though I often found his silence frustrating. I craved attention and laughter, so I started making small jokes at Jonathan's expense during dinners and gatherings. Everyone laughed, which made me believe I was only being playful and harmless. When Jonathan looked uncomfortable, I told people he was too sensitive, and they believed me, because silence looks like weakness. My sister Selena encouraged me, saying, a woman should never let her husband forget who had the real power. My father Robert thought I was being funny, though he sometimes frowned, like he knew I was going too far. Jonathan's mother Margaret never laughed, and always gave me a look that made me feel like a misbehaving child. I ignored her because I wanted to believe I was right and everyone else was overreacting. One night during a family meal, I crossed a line when I joked that Jonathan's gym trainer Ethan knew better how to please a woman. I said it for attention and the laughter I craved, but the silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt before. The silence in that room after my remark felt crushing because it was not the usual pause before nervous laughter, but a stillness that made my chest tighten. Selena gave a forced laugh, trying to rescue me, but her eyes darted toward Jonathan's face, as if even she knew I had crossed too far. Robert cleared his throat and tried to wave it off with a half smile, though I noticed he did not actually laugh this time. Margaret's stare was sharp and unblinking, and I felt like she wanted to drag me out of the house that moment. Jonathan sat perfectly still with no anger on his face, only a kind of calmness that was worse than shouting. I told everyone he was sulking again, and I said he needed to stop taking every joke so seriously. Some people nodded and shifted in their seats, but the mood never returned to normal, and I felt exposed. Later that night, I told myself Jonathan would forget like he always did, because silence had always been his way of moving past conflict. I convinced myself that I had won again, because I made the room focus on me, and Jonathan had given nothing in return. What I did not realize then was that his silence was not surrender this time, it was planning. Around that period, I had been texting Ethan more than I should have, and enjoying his playful compliments about my energy and style. I told myself it was harmless, because it was only messages, and Jonathan never made me feel that spark anymore. Selena told me I deserved to enjoy myself, and that no one could blame me for wanting a little excitement. She said Jonathan should be grateful I stayed, when I clearly had other options, and I let myself believe her. I began meeting Ethan for short coffees after my work shifts, and I laughed with him in a way that felt freeing. I carried those laughs home, and looked across at Jonathan, thinking he had no right to complain when I was still keeping our family together. But Jonathan had started watching me more closely, though he said nothing out loud. He began staying late in his office with a locked drawer that I once noticed but dismissed as more spreadsheets. I kept telling myself he was boring and predictable, and that nothing he did could ever threaten me. The children began noticing changes too, because Lily asked why Daddy always seemed sad at dinner, while Aaron clung to Jonathan instead of me. I told them Daddy was just tired from work, and I brushed off the way their little eyes studied me. Margaret confronted me one evening, saying directly that I was humiliating her son, and I snapped back that she was interfering. I told Jonathan she was poisoning him against me, but he only stayed silent, which infuriated me more. Robert continued to excuse me, though, with less conviction, and I could tell he was growing uncomfortable with my behavior. Ethan started pushing for more of my time, and I told him Jonathan was controlling, which was not true, but sounded good in my head. I enjoyed painting myself as the trapped one, while ignoring the fact that I was the one creating distance. At another gathering, I mocked Jonathan again by saying even Ethan could handle things better than him, and this time Jonathan quietly stood and left without a word. I laughed it off, telling everyone he was dramatic and too fragile, but inside, I felt something shift that I could not explain away. Selina squeezed my hand, saying I had nothing to worry about, but her voice was thinner than before. Margaret said she could not watch anymore, and Robert warned me softly that I might be pushing too hard. The next morning, a courier arrived with an envelope addressed to me, and my hands shook before I even opened it. Inside were legal papers showing Jonathan had contacted a lawyer and was filing for divorce along with custody arrangements. My first instinct was to tell myself it was a bluff, meant to scare me, because Jonathan had never stood up to me before. I called his phone to demand an explanation, but it went to voicemail, and I left long messages telling him he was overreacting. When I told Selina, she insisted he would not follow through and that he was only trying to scare me. But then Margaret called me later and told me plainly that Jonathan was serious and already had evidence to bring forward. I accused her of meddling and trying to destroy my marriage, but her steady voice made my chest sink because I knew she was right. That was the moment I realized silence had never been weakness at all, it had been strategy. Jonathan's silence became harder to ignore once the papers were in my hands, because he carried himself with a calm that unsettled me more than any argument could. He moved around the house with the same routines as before, cooking for Lily and helping Aaron with his puzzles, but he did it without involving me at all. I tried to start conversations telling him he was making a mistake and breaking apart the family, but he simply continued with his tasks as if I were not in the room. I told the children their father was stressed and overreacting, but their little faces told me they did not believe my excuses anymore. Lily asked if everything was my fault, and I quickly said no, insisting her father just wanted more control. When Aaron clung to Jonathan during bedtime, I told myself it was because he was being manipulated by Margaret, but deep down, I knew the children were choosing safety over my chaos. I confided in Selina, who told me to get ahead of the story by telling friends and neighbors that Jonathan was cruel with money and too focused on control. I followed her advice and hinted that Jonathan cared more about his job and bank account than about me or the children. Some people nodded politely, but I noticed their eyes were distant, as if they already knew another version of the truth. Later, I discovered why, because Jonathan had quietly shown them messages and receipts from my meetings with Ethan. He had screenshots of playful texts, where I said I preferred Ethan's energy, and even photos of us together at the cafe near my office. I told myself he must have spied on me, but in truth I had been careless with my phone and careless with my behavior. When he began pulling out organized folders with dates and details, I felt the ground shift beneath me, because it was no longer his word against mine. Margaret stood proudly at his side, supporting him, while Robert looked at me with disappointment, heavier than any lecture. Selina still told me I was strong, and that men always back down when pushed, but even she looked uneasy when she saw how prepared Jonathan was. Ethan, meanwhile, started backing away quickly once he realized lawyers were involved, and I barely heard from him, except for one message saying he wanted no part of drama. I felt humiliated because I had risked everything for a man who vanished the moment things became difficult. Jonathan, on the other hand, grew stronger in his quietness, presenting himself as calm and collected, while I looked frantic and defensive. I began accusing him of trying to trap me, saying he had been planning this for months, but my words sounded weak compared to the neat rows of evidence he placed in front of everyone. At another dinner where both families were present, Jonathan laid out some of the documents showing clear proof of my humiliating remarks and private messages. Margaret nodded firmly, saying this was why her son had finally taken action, while Robert lowered his head and admitted he could not defend me anymore. Selina tried to argue on my behalf, but her voice faded when Jonathan calmly explained that his only concern was Lily and Aaron's stability. Hearing him speak so softly, yet with so much control, made me realize he was no longer the man I could dismiss as boring or weak. He was building a case that no one could deny, and the more I tried to gaslight the situation, the more desperate I appeared. My jokes that once made people laugh now made them uncomfortable, because everyone knew the consequences were no longer funny. The children clung to Jonathan, and even in their silence I could hear their choice. For the first time I felt true fear, not because Jonathan raised his voice, but because he never had to. Every move he made was through documents and lawyers and quiet persistence, while I was left scrambling with excuses that no one wanted to hear anymore. And in that shift, I realized I had lost control of the story I thought I owned. The court date arrived quicker than I could process, and I walked into the building dressed as neatly as I could, telling myself appearances still mattered. I rehearsed lines in my head about being a good mother and a loyal wife, insisting that my little jokes had been harmless, and my friendship with Ethan was only for fun. I convinced myself the judge would see Jonathan as cold and rigid, while I appeared lively and misunderstood. But the confidence I carried began to crack the moment his lawyer opened their folder. One by one, they laid out text messages where I had compared Jonathan unfavorably to Ethan and complained that Jonathan lacked excitement, words I once said to feel powerful but now looked cruel on paper. They had receipts of coffee meetings, late-night calls, and even screenshots where I told Selena that Jonathan was boring and weak. I tried to argue those were exaggerations, just casual venting, but my voice sounded thin in the silent courtroom. Jonathan sat calmly beside his lawyer, never raising his voice, simply nodding as each piece of evidence was presented. His mother Margaret watched with folded arms and an expression that told everyone she believed this was justice. My father Robert sat behind me but did not intervene, and his silence spoke volumes about his disappointment. Selena tried to give me a reassuring look, but I could tell even she was shaken by how organized and damning the evidence was. When it was my turn to speak, I insisted that Jonathan was overreacting and destroying the family for nothing. But the judge asked directly whether I had indeed joked about Ethan in front of relatives. I tried to laugh it off and said I had only been playful, but no one in the room smiled, and the words hung in the air like a confession. Jonathan's lawyer continued to point out how my behavior affected the children, describing how Lily had asked why her father looked so sad and how Aaron had clung to him during stressful moments. Hearing my own children's names used as examples of harm made me feel small and powerless. I tried to counter by saying Jonathan was distant and obsessed with money, but the judge had already seen the contrast between his quiet evidence and my frantic defenses. Every excuse I gave was met with another document or statement, and slowly, I realized there was no way to twist this narrative anymore. The judge eventually ruled that Jonathan would receive primary custody of Lily and Aaron, with me limited to visitation, and he would also retain control of the house. My chest tightened as the words were read, because the very stability I once mocked was being placed firmly in his hands. Jonathan did not gloat or look at me with triumph. He simply gathered the papers and stood with a dignity that cut deeper than anger ever could. Margaret embraced him as we left, while Robert told me quietly that Jonathan had been right all along, and even Selena said nothing. I felt the weight of everyone's silence pressing down on me harder than any argument. For the first time, I truly understood that silence was never weakness. It had been Jonathan's greatest strength, and it had destroyed the world I thought I controlled. When we returned home after the ruling, the house felt different, even though nothing had physically changed, because every wall and corner now belonged to Jonathan by law. He moved through the rooms with calm certainty, gathering Lily's homework sheets and helping Aaron find his favorite toy, while I stood in the hallway holding nothing but the visitation schedule. I tried to tell him we could still work things out, and that I was ready to change, but he did not respond with anger or forgiveness. He simply placed another envelope on the counter, reminding me of the judge's decision. Inside were finalized documents confirming his custody rights, his control of the house, and the limited time I would have with the children. My hands trembled as I read, because the details were cold and factual, leaving no space for charm or excuses. I told myself I still had power because the children loved me, but when I tried to hug Lily, she gently pulled away, saying she needed to help her father with something. Aaron avoided eye contact altogether and clung to Jonathan's side like a shadow. I felt like a guest in the home where I once laughed the loudest, and every sound of their laughter without me pierced deeper than any argument. Selena called that evening, urging me not to give up and suggesting I appeal, but her voice lacked conviction, and I realized even she no longer believed my story. Robert came by the next day and told me directly that Jonathan had shown strength, not cruelty, and that I needed to face what I had done. Hearing that from my father made my chest ache because he had always defended me until now. Margaret did not speak to me at all, but I saw her helping Jonathan carry groceries and tucking Lily's hair behind her ear, and her presence in my place felt like another judgment. Ethan had completely vanished by then, leaving no trace except the printed texts that had been read in court. I scrolled through old messages trying to remember why I risked everything, but the thrill that once made me feel powerful now looked cheap and pathetic. Jonathan never gloated, never raised his voice, never looked at me with anger. He simply carried on with steady dignity that reminded everyone who the stronger person had always been. I tried one last time to tell him we could rebuild, but he walked past me in silence, the finalized papers in his hand. And I knew then that the silence I once ridiculed was the final answer to everything. The nights after the final papers felt like walking through someone else's house, because the walls still held my pictures, but the life inside them no longer belonged to me. Jonathan tucked Lily and Aaron into bed with calm patience while I lingered outside their door, listening to the soft sound of their laughter, realizing I was no longer part of their nightly rhythm. I tried to remind them during my visitation hours that I was still their mother, but Clara asked more about what her father had planned for the week than about anything I was offering. Aaron barely let go of Jonathan's hand when I was near, and each time I reached for him, he pulled back gently, his silence speaking louder than words. I told myself Jonathan was turning them against me, but the truth was easier to see in their eyes. They simply trusted him more than they trusted me. Selena eventually stopped encouraging me because even she admitted Jonathan had proven himself stronger than either of us imagined. She said she had never seen a man so calm while being humiliated, and she confessed she admired his strength even though she had always taken my side. Robert visited once and told me directly that Jonathan had done what any responsible father would do, and he urged me to stop fighting against a reality that had already been written. Margaret did not need to say anything, because her quiet presence in the house, her hands helping Jonathan fold laundry or prepare meals, told me everything about where loyalties lay. Ethan had disappeared completely, and I felt foolish even remembering how I had believed his attention meant something lasting. Jonathan never once mentioned his name. He never accused me openly, never gave me the drama I always expected. He simply erased him from relevance by proving who truly mattered. I tried blaming stress, boredom, even family pressure, but none of my excuses made sense anymore because the facts had already destroyed my story. The silence that used to frustrate me had turned into Jonathan's greatest weapon, because in silence, he gathered evidence, built his case, and showed the world the truth. My laughter once made people uncomfortable. Now it only reminded them of why I had lost. Jonathan walked through the home with dignity, guiding our children and managing everything, while I stood on the sidelines, reduced to a visitor in the life I once believed I controlled. Every step he took in silence felt like another reminder that words had undone me, and silence had saved him. When he passed me in the hallway one evening, papers in hand and children trailing behind him, he did not even glance my way, and that quiet dismissal carried more weight than any fight we ever had. The evening the judge's final order arrived, I felt the weight of everything I had done settle onto my shoulders in a way no amount of denial could soften. Jonathan came into the kitchen with the envelope in his hand, placed it on the counter, and walked past me with the calm stride that had become his only weapon. Lily and Aaron followed him, their voices bright as they told him about their day, while I stood frozen by the counter staring at the papers as if they were glowing. I had once believed that laughter made me powerful, that my little jokes reminded everyone I was in control, but the truth was now written in neat black print, telling me I had lost my marriage, my home, and even the steady presence of my children. When I opened the papers, the words felt colder than ice. Primary custody to Jonathan, continued residence in the family home, visitation rights for me, financial protections granted in his favor. Every line cut deeper because each one was proof that he had been patient, thorough, and relentless in his silence. I wanted to shout that it was unfair, that I was still their mother, but what voice did I have left when every attempt at speaking had become another reminder of why I was here? I tried to salvage something by gathering Lily and Aaron during one of my visitation days, telling them I was still the fun parent and that their father only cared about schedules and money. Lily tilted her head and asked softly why I'd said those things about him if I loved him, and I could not form an answer. Erin simply tugged at her sleeve and asked when Daddy was coming to pick them up. My chest ached with a pain I could not mask, but I still blamed Jonathan in my head, convincing myself he had poisoned them with his silence. Yet I knew the truth. They had seen the cracks themselves. They had heard the things I said at dinners. They had watched me laugh at their father while he swallowed his pride. Jonathan had not needed to twist their view. I had done that all by myself. At work, I felt eyes following me everywhere. People who once chatted with me avoided my desk or offered polite, empty smiles that carried pity instead of friendliness. A coworker who used to join me for lunch excused herself, saying she had a call, and I knew she just did not want to be seen with me. I convinced myself Jonathan had shared more than necessary, but in reality, I had left trails everywhere. Texts, careless words, public remarks. Ethan had vanished the moment Jonathan's lawyer surfaced. His name did not appear in any message on my phone anymore. I scrolled through our old conversations one night, looking for that spark I once thought was worth everything. But all I saw was shallow flattery and empty promises that collapsed at the first sign of consequence. I realized I had risked my family for words that meant nothing, and the man I betrayed for had vanished like he had never existed. Selena still called sometimes, but her voice had changed. She no longer told me I was powerful or clever. Instead, she reminded me to accept what had happened and stop fighting battles already lost. She admitted she admired Jonathan's strength now, because he had fought me without ever raising his voice. Her words made me burn with shame, because even my sister, who had once cheered me on, had turned to his side. Robert visited less often, and when he did, he carried disappointment instead of defense. He told me Jonathan had done what any responsible man would do: protect his children, protect his home, protect himself. I wanted to hate him for saying it, but deep down I knew he was right. Margaret did not speak to me at all, yet her steady presence in Jonathan's life was the loudest judgment of all. She slipped into the role of guide and supporter with ease, helping Lily with her braids, reading Aaron's stories, filling the space I had once thought secure. Each time I came for visitation, I felt like a guest in the house I once ruled. Jonathan did not argue. He did not explain. He simply handed me the schedule and let me take the children when the papers allowed. He moved through his routines with quiet dignity, never giving me the satisfaction of conflict. And every time I reached for a fight, his silence cut me down more than shouting ever could. Lily and Aaron began to thrive under his steady care, their laughter sounding brighter, their footsteps lighter, and each smile they gave him reminded me of what I had lost. I once believed Jonathan's silence was weakness, that my words and jokes proved my control. But his silence had been patience, his silence had been strategy, his silence had been gathering every piece of evidence until he no longer needed to defend himself. In the end, silence was stronger than all my laughter, and it left me standing outside the home I once mocked, staring through the windows at a family that no longer belonged to me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching? You watching? You watching? You watching? You watching?